Hey fourth grade, welcome to our second video. Today we're going to talk about pollination. That might sound familiar because we learned about it a little bit when we talked about plant life cycles before our classroom turned into a virtual classroom. When we first learned about plant life cycles, we learned 4 different stages. The first stage being a seed, the second stage being germination, or also known as sprouting, which we talked about in our last video. The third stage being stems and roots growing more. And the fourth and final stage we talked about was flowering. Now there's actually one final stage in the life cycle of a plant called pollination. Pollination is the process that allows plants to reproduce. What does that mean? Basically, it's when a seed turns into a plant and then a seed is created again. Here's an example of a bee pollinating a flower as it goes from one flower to another carrying the pollen. Now, it's not that simple though. There's a whole complicated process involved for pollination to happen. Now, to understand this process, we're first going to need to discuss the different parts of a flowering plant. And no, they're not stem, leaf, flower, and root like we already learned, but we're actually going to talk about the structure of the inside of a plant that helps reproduction and hence pollination occur. Here we have a diagram of a flower in detail. Imagine if you cut a flower right in half. That is what you are looking at right now. Now let's go over each part one by one. We are first going to take a look at the first two parts that we usually notice on a flower, the petal and the sepal. The sepal is the outer part of a flower that protects the inside, while the petal is usually the brightly colored part of the flower that attracts pollinators such as bees. While these two parts are very important to the flower, they do not actually take part in pollination. Therefore, we are going to focus on these two big areas, the stamen and the pistil. First, let's look at the stamen. The stamen of a flower is where the pollen is produced or created. The stamen has two parts, the filament and the anther. The anther is the part that creates the pollen. The filament, on the other hand, is like the body of the anther. The filament is a thin structure that supports the anther. Next, we have the pistil. The pistil is the part of a flower that takes in new pollen to reproduce seeds. The pistil has 3 parts, the stigma, the style, and the ovule. The stigma is the head of the pistil. It receives the pollen first. Then the pollen goes down to the style. The style is structured like a tube and carries the pollen down even further into the flower. Finally, the pollen lands in the ovule. The ovule is the egg of a flower, and flowers usually have more than one ovule. When pollen lands and interacts with the ovules grow into a seed. Finally, the process of pollination is complete. Wait, but how does pollen go from the stamen to the pistil? Flowers can't move pollen from its own stamen to its pistil. It actually needs to spread its pollen to another flower. This is where pollinators come into play. A pollinator is an animal that moves pollen from one flower to another. It's like the mailman for flowers. Many of you already know the most famous pollinator, the bee. Can you guess what other animals are pollinators? If you remember the pollinator mystery game we played back in school, you'll get this one correct. Other pollinators include butterflies, hummingbirds, flies, moths, and even bats. And actually, even humans can be pollinators accidentally, like when we carry dandelion seeds that stick on our clothes to somewhere else. Next time you see a honeybee flying around, stop and think before you panic. That bee is probably doing a lot of work, helping to grow the plants around us. A lot of the vegetables and fruits we eat are pollinated thanks to honeybees, including apples, blueberries, broccoli, melons, and cherries, only to name a few. Okay, well, I did a lot of talking, so I have something for you to do while I go take a water break. Okay, so let's review. First, pollination is the process that allows plants to reproduce. Second, in order for a plant to pollinate, pollen has to be moved from a flower's stamen to another flower's pistil. And third, a pollinator is an animal that moves pollen from one flower to another. Okay, that concludes our second science lesson. Your assignments for the week will be posted on our Google Classroom page. If you have any questions still about pollination, parts of a flower, or even related topics, email me. Once again, my email is ktrimble@glasw.org.